Hello and thanks for watching. This video, Prelude to Revolution, really covers a lot of Chapter 7 in the American pageant, but also parts of 6 and 8. So let's get started. If you want to think contextualization and the big points, we're going to be talking about the idea of colonial autonomy versus imperial reform and the slow shift towards imperial reform that follows the French and Indian War. We'll also be talking about the idea of escalation and polarization, that being that the conflict will escalate and that the two sides, the colonials and their British friends across the pond, will increasingly become polarized. We can talk about what a revolution is and how to define that, but in this case, we're talking about a transfer of sovereignty. And so really the support for that in the colonies is only about 1/3 of the population at its height, and that's obviously going to lead to an uphill climb. Also want to mention that leadership in this revolution, a lot of it comes from Massachusetts and Virginia, and those two, you could say, are homogenous states, or colonies at this point, actually. Virginia really being united behind the planter class, and Massachusetts with a strong sense of community with their Puritan roots. Also, the people were very involved, as much as they wanted to be at least, in the town hall meeting system that was used in New England, and there was also good communication between the towns and the cities. Many issues existed in the West, and this is what the British were actually trying to address with the Proclamation of 1763. And you can see on this map here, it says the Northwest Territory. This is what the United States will actually label this territory as, and will actually deal with the same issues upon independence. There's conflicting land claims. There's a question of what will the land be used for. There's defense issues, both from European powers and natives, Indian relations in general, and also questions for the British, at least, as what to do with the government for Canada. Obviously, the colonies couldn't handle these on their own, and so it makes sense for Britain as a colonial power to address these. So the British solution to those Western problems will be the Proclamation of 1763, and I do have a handout that I'll give out in class here, because it's much more than just a proclamation line, although that's probably the point that we'll be talking about the most. Especially after Pontiac's rebellion, the British have a need to restrict colonial movement into the area. Of course, the British colonials sort of ignored that, at least many did. How do you implement this proclamation? The British will send Commander Lord Geoffrey Amherst to the region with 10,000 redcoats, and obviously those troops need to be trained and transported and equipped and fed and so forth. And so the colonists will be expected to pay for this. After all, it is going to be for their defense. There are many groups who were upset by the proclamation, including land speculators that would like to have profited from the development of that region, the French and the Indians that are still in the region, and colonists that may have had land claims to that region, including those Virginians that sent George Washington to the region at the start of the French and Indian War. So let's see how the British are going to pay for this. They're going to use these revenue-raising acts, the first of which is called the Revenue Act of 1764, or just more commonly the Sugar Act. And it's no longer protective. Instead, it's designed to raise money, and it actually encouraged smuggling, because while the tariff was reduced, it actually was enforced. Now, the colonists were used to this situation of salutary neglect, where they kind of had free rein to do what they wanted to do. And furthermore, if they actually violated this and were caught, they'd be tried in a vice admiralty court, which was not even in the colonies. And in fact, they were also deemed guilty until proven innocent. And so that's a major sting, as I said before, to the colonists, especially New England, who traded a lot of rum. Obviously, folks were disappointed with this Revenue Act, such as James Otis of Massachusetts, who said the taxation without consent was invalid. And as you can see, that he doesn't really make a distinction between taxes for revenue and protective tariffs. He kind of labels them all the same. Despite this, the Sugar Act was expected to raise 40,000 pounds annually. Now, as I said, people were upset about the Sugar Act, but that agitation did die down a bit. The Quartering Act, however, kept it alive, and it required colonies, not individuals, to provide lodging and provisions for British redcoats. The second revenue reform, and this is a big one, folks, is the Stamp Act in 1765, and it was expected to bring 60,000 pounds per year annually, and it was almost pure profit. As you can see, the stamps don't really cost a lot for the British to actually manufacture and actually use. So therefore, obviously you can see I've emphasized here that the protest over the Stamp Act actually allied middle and working classes. And so you see groups like the Sons of Liberty using this sort of mob mentality and mob approach, but in a lot of ways it united colonists like they hadn't been previously. In addition to allying multiple groups of colonists, it also got more people involved. It mobilized those that previously sat on the sideline. And this is done with public pressure, as I said before, with the Sons of Liberty. And again, this is sort of escalating the conflict and further polarizing the colonies from Great Britain. More escalation. Taxation without representation is tyranny, said Patrick Henry. Here's a pretty revolutionary act in the calling of the Stamp Act Congress. Colonies will send delegates to New York City in 1765, and they will petition Parliament and the Crown and say something pretty bold, that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional, vowing to never use those stamps. Here's a very, very well-known cartoon from the day. Don't affix the stamp. Another Franklin cartoon. We did look at the Join or Die cartoon the other day in class, but you can see the dangers of Britain losing her American colonies here, as this woman has lost her limbs. And so the act will be repealed in 1766, but the British do issue the Declaratory Act in the same year, stating that Britain has the right to tax and govern in all cases whatsoever. The Townshend Acts are issued in 1767, and now custom duties are going to be placed on English goods, including paint, lead, paper, glass, and tea. We'll come back to tea here soon enough. Again, it's expected to raise significant revenue. Name for Champagne Charlie here, Charles Townshend. The British also begin to use these writs of assistance as sort of an open search warrant to search and seize anything based on their suspicion. So colonial merchant vessels may be boarded and goods confiscated if those goods are suspected to be smuggled goods. These were also used in Britain, so it wasn't specifically for the colonies only. Now, of course, the Townshend Acts were designed to raise revenue, but part of that money was going to be used to pay the salaries to the administrative personnel, which means that those who were in charge of enforcing the Townshend Acts or policing over them would not be paid by colonial governments and colonial bodies. So therefore, they're free of colonial influence, and they should be able to work more honestly. There is an embargo that follows the Townshend Acts, and it was less effective. A lot of smuggling occurred in Boston. As a result of that, the British landed 2 regiments of troops in 1768. And now, if you want to think about escalation, we have armed conflict between British regulars and a crowd of Bostonians. And of course, we call this the Boston Massacre. Here's Paul Revere's classic portrayal of this. So there's a crowd of 60 or so Bostonians that are taunting and throwing rocks and snowballs at these British regulars, and without orders, they did fire into the crowd, killing and wounding about a dozen people, as you can see here, including Crispus Attucks, a man of African descent. Here's a later depiction of the event where they actually showed Crispus Attucks in the center. And while it's not exact as the Paul Revere version, it has a lot of similar qualities. You can see the look in the eyes of the British soldiers here, and certainly it portrays the colonists as victims in this. It's really an ultimate propaganda piece. Keeping in line with colonial unity, a Committee of Correspondence is born after the Boston Massacre, and now you have colonies that are communicating. Common terms are used. It's a common voice that begins to emerge, and so it sort of breaks down some of the regional differences amongst the colonies. And while it begins in Massachusetts, it quickly spreads to Virginia. Again, the 2 colonies that I mentioned at the start of this presentation that were very influential in this sort of radical movement. Sam Adams wrote the Massachusetts Circular Letter, which called the American legislatures equal to Parliament. It's sort of the beginning of that Committee of Correspondence. On to the Tea Act now. In 1773, the British East India Company, a major corporation in 18th century Britain, basically had a surplus of tea. And so they're given a monopoly of the tea industry in the colonies to help them unload that tea. And their tea was cheaper, and it was just as good as all other teas, but the colonists did not want to buy tea from the British East India Company. And again, it's sort of a principle that they're clinging on to. There were massive demonstrations in New York and Philadelphia, turning ships back that had tea on them. The governor of Boston, Tom Hutchinson, ordered the tea-bearing ships in Boston Harbor not to leave and to stay. And on December 16, 1773, 100 or so Bostonians dressed up like Native Americans boarded the ships and smashed 342 chests of tea. And here is an artist's rendition of the Boston Tea Party. You can see folks dressed up like natives, and certainly those in attendance are very much in support of this. In class, we'll talk about sort of the idea of where do you stand? Are you for order or are you for liberty? Do you stand behind mob violence? Are you concerned about this growing, escalating sort of mob mentality? Is the principle that important to you, or is it not? Aside from divisions along the lines of are you for liberty or for order, you have to realize that not all of the merchants support this. And I would imagine that the destruction of private property would alarm some people, especially British merchants and colonial Tories, or those who are loyal to the British Crown. They want their property protected. But tea in itself was uniting in that it was kind of the everyman's drink. And the reaction that the British have to the Boston Tea Party only unites the colonists even more. Before we talk about the reaction of the British to the Tea Party, just say these are estimated numbers here, that as late as 1773, probably no more than 1% of American colonials would have favored independence from Britain. More probably would have preferred some sort of home rule within the empire. But by 1776, we have 1/3 of the population supporting this sort of radical cause. 1/3 remained loyal, and 1/3 probably kept quiet. Now, in 1774, the British reaction to the Boston Tea Party we call them the Intolerable Acts, but the British called them the Coercive Acts, as in coercion, a way to sort of force the colonists back in line. The first thing they do is they close the port of Boston, which punished pretty much everybody in Boston, not just those involved. We also saw the Administration of Justice Act, in which British officers and agents accused of violations would be tried in England rather than Massachusetts, again, sort of squashing some of that colonial autonomy and threatening local justice. We had the Massachusetts Government Act, which changed the government of the colony. The governor now, again, the governor is appointed by the Crown. He could appoint his own council. He could prohibit town meetings. Keep in mind, the town meeting was a fundamental piece of New England society from the 1600s on, right? Also could appoint local judges and sheriffs, which then selected jurors. So clearly the governor assumes much more power and authority, and it takes that from the local Massachusetts government. Obviously now there's a lot of tension between some in Boston and the British troops, and so the increased presence of those troops is not going to help that. It's going to further escalate the conflict. But we have a resurgence of the Quartering Act, in which towns are required to house British soldiers as well. We will take a look at this propaganda piece in class. We'll do the HIP analysis here, but please note that it occurred 4 weeks after the Boston Tea Party, and this is a piece of British propaganda. All right, so in 1774, 12 colonies, I think Georgia was the one that did not, sent 55 delegates to the First Continental Congress. And we see the emergence of some very prominent political figures, such as John Adams, who's arguing for a revolutionary course, while others still prefer the idea of home rule within the empire or a removal of the Intolerable Acts. But they did accomplish some big things. They wrote a Declaration of Rights. They appealed to the king and other colonies. They also created the association, the Continental Association. And what it did was enforce a complete boycott of British goods, including non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption. So obviously we don't want to play what if in history. That's not really a good thing to do. But in 1891, historian Paul Leicester Ford pointed out that the Continental Congress didn't really have a leg to stand on. And if they had these things you see here, such as a military or funding even, then perhaps they could have been in a position to enforce its own wishes against Great Britain. But that certainly was not the case. So as there was no real government way to enforce the embargo, we see the rise of the Continental Association. It's kind of a grassroots movement to enforce the principles that the Continental Congress kind of stood for. They used local associations to police individuals' behavior. They used intimidation. They might publish your name in the newspaper if, in fact, you were importing British goods, that sort of thing. So, again, you may not necessarily be on board with the ideas of the Continental Congress. Maybe you are a loyalist, but do you want to be sort of singled out by the Continental Association and identified as such, or do you kind of quietly go along with that? Or perhaps you're even encouraged to, sort of take up the principles and, in fact, become more radical in nature. Okay, that's it for this section. I appreciate you watching. Please note we are going to have a quiz on the various acts that are discovered in this Revenue Acts. There should be a link to the Quizlet in the description. If you have any questions, please just let me know or post them here. Take care.